Well, for more on Liu He's visit to the U.S. and China-U.S. trade ties, we have Nathan King still with us. And let's also bring in Yun Sun. She's a senior associate with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, first of all, what do you think these proposed tariffs are going to do for trade relations, especially as we have China's top economic advisor here in Washington to really try and ease trade tensions?
Well, because of the blanket nature of this tariff on basically global producers or exporters of steel and aluminum to the United States, we're going to see reactions or retaliatory measures from all these trading partners across the globe. So that's on a global level. But then on a bilateral level, it has to remind people that Liu He is indeed here today as Trump was making these announcements. And I think it casts a negative outlook as for the negotiations and how it could potentially solve or mitigate the tension between U.S. and China over the trade issues.
And Nathan, as we look at the size and the scope of the trade relationship between China and the U.S., how significant is this to their overall trade ties?
Look, it's not overly significant. China, as you know, is well down on that list, and we're only talking about 2% of supply. But it's really the atmosphere it creates. And, you know, we've already had solar panels, we've already had washing machines, we've already had aluminium foil, we've already had, now we have steel and aluminum. What's next? Because, as you know, the Trump administration has been a battle between these globalists and economic nationalists. And the economic nationalists, people like Peter Navarro, who wrote that book, Death by China, you can see where he stands, are on the ascendancy at the moment. And the other thing is that the big US effort has been to pull China into the rules-based system it created, the WTO, essentially the rules written by the US. They are now ignoring that structure and basically setting a bad example. We are headed, if it doesn't stop, for a trade war.
And what do you think would be a more productive and mutually beneficial way to handle some of these trade situations?
There's no easy answer to that question. Like for the globalists and people who advocate for free trade, the assumption that they had about China is that if we engage China enough, if we work with China sincerely and with enough efforts, then China will adapt to our rules someday. But the counter-argument these days that are prevalent among the Trump administration is that we have tried that engagement policy. We have nurtured China for the past 4 decades, basically since the beginning of the reform and opening up. And guess what? China is now strong, and China has shown no inclination to adapt to our rules. So the answer that for the protectionists and people who feel that China has failed to meet the American desire for China to change, the answer that they prescribe is that we need to get tough on China because China is not going to change anyway.
Now, we know that President Trump, no matter what you think about his policies, he is sticking by his America First agenda. But now there are concerns that what's supposed to be helping and protecting American workers and Americans could essentially end up hurting them with these sorts of policies.
Well, we saw John Terra with the Dow there. It was down 500 points straight after the announcement. In fact, there were even people in the industry, aluminum and steel, saying, don't do this. Why? Because it artificially raises prices, and it also artificially raises prices not just in steel, but also at the end user, whether you're having a can of beer or whether you're building an aeroplane. And what it also does is give false hope to these industries. If you look at China, they are massively cutting supply, which is one of the big finger-pointing exercises that the US has done. They have been doing so for many years and will continue to do so. They will get out of uncompetitive industries, and that's what they're doing. The US is essentially turning back the clock on its own steel and aluminum industry.
So let's turn now to some of the areas where they can see cooperation going forward. What do you see as the real positives that could come out of this visit?
Wow, that's a difficult one.
There isn't, is there?
I don't see anything. I do not see a lot of good news coming out of what's being announced. But one piece of potentially positive news is that Trump could be using these signs as a tool to indicate that the U.S. is adopting a very tough position on trade, and therefore China better make concessions as Trump administration demands. So you could argue that this announcement, which has not been implemented yet and could potentially be the implementation could start next week, but you could argue that Trump administration might be using this as a negotiation technique.
And we've certainly seen that play out in other situations with other topics.
Yeah, I don't think it's a negotiating ploy. I think they're going through with it. They wouldn't have taken all this time, energy, and it's not just on the tariffs. For example, investment in the US, the Committee for Foreign Investments, they're basically tripling the staff. They're looking at investigations into industries they've never looked into, not just semiconductors before. There is a real change of attitude here, and we're seeing it playing out in real time.
And I also want to look at this idea. You have the two biggest economies taking such divergent approaches when it comes to negotiating trade and even on their take on globalization. What impact does that have on global trade?
I think both powers want globalization, but on their own terms. Because if you ask the American protectionists, they will say that China's economy is not so open. There are certain procedures and measures that China adopts domestically that prohibits or hinders free trade. So I think both countries want to have the terms on have the trade on their own terms, and it's certainly not a good demonstration or good example for the rest of the world. I have to say that since the inauguration of the Trump administration, China has been portraying itself or trying to take up the leadership role in terms of advocating the global governance reform, advocating for globalization, and there are a lot of criticism here in the United States domestically that U.S. is basically willingly giving up its leadership role in the world.
All right, we'll have to see how all this plays out next week. Thank you so much, Yun Sun there with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, and of course, our own Nathan King.